Hello, I'll say good evening to everyone who's in the same time zone as me and good morning to the rest of you. I'm going to be talking about, yikes, give me a second. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the Abject and the Sublime Malay Folk Horror and Material Culture in P Ramlee, Sumpah or Minyak. I'm just going to start with an apology because this isn't as good as I wanted it to be. As I was telling Sam, November has been an incredibly insane month for me. I am actually presenting 3 papers this month and running 2 events. So that's my apology. And the other thing is to start with the content warning. As you've seen on the abstract, there is going to be some, not much, because there isn't much in the movie itself of the issue of rape that is happening in Sumpah Orang Minyak. There's a bit of it. So if this is something that upsets you, I'm just going to repeat my disclaimer because I don't want people to be triggered by my talk. So having said that, I will just move you to this topic that I've been working on as for an article. Recently, I've been very fascinated by the idea of material culture as I've noticed more and more as I work with my text, I'm more and more focused on the stories and the ideologies behind how those texts were produced. So let me just go to the next page. So this is the abstract which was on the website. I'll just give you a moment to read it. Maybe I'll read it for you. P Ramlee's Sumpah Orang Minyak is a movie that revisits the figure of Malay folk horror, the Orang Minyak, who is an oil-covered man who terrorizes and violates young women. Portrayed as being covered in black oil, this figure may be read as the embodiment of Christavan abjection. However, P. Ramlee's cinematic treatment of this figure also embodies the Burkean sublime in the portrayal of the world of the Buan, which is embodied in Ramlee's vision as a mythical Malay celestial kingdom full of the glitter and glamour of an ethereal civilization. However, the two extremes represented by P. Ramlee's interpretation of the Orang Minyak have a most startling beginning in the movie. The protagonist turned villain is a deformed and disabled young artist who has to produce batik patterns for production, and at the crux of his transformation was the struggle to produce more current and more fashionable patterns to be purchased. By catalyzing the ascension of the protagonist into the kingdom of the Buan and then his fall from this sublimity into abjection and evil to the commodification of art, P. Ramlee's movie excites further investigation and inquiry. And this is where the material culture aspect actually kind of appeared to me as a kind of a light bulb moment. It is true that this cinematic treatment inscribes upon this figure art of Malay folk horror, the larger-than-life character arcs seen in Gothic novels such as Matthew Lewis's The Monk, but Ramlee also implicates commerce and the commodification of the artistic process in depicting the ascension and then the abjection of the protagonist. Therefore, I aim to investigate the nature of the transformation undertaken by Ramlee, one of Malaysia's most celebrated filmmakers, in Sumpah Orang Minyak, by juxtaposing the binary relationship of the Christavan abject and the Burkean sublime with considerations of a material culture perspective. The expected findings hinge upon Ramlee's observations of a 1950s Malaysian society, also Singaporean because the movie was actually produced in Singapore, and his own struggles balancing art with commerce as a movie maker. So the tortured psyche of the protagonist and villain then may be an indictment of the demands of the industry in the golden age of the Malay movie. Now, who was the oily man? This is a figure of folk horror and urban legend in Malaysian popular culture, but also in the crime pages. As is often the case in a society like ours, where in Malaysia, where people are still believing in these supernatural things, and you still have people going to medicine men whom we call bomos. We have this kind of occurrences in our newspapers every now and then, not as much as before, but as recently as 2022, the national dailies were reporting cases of Orang Minyak crimes where you see men in oily, kind of like covered in oil, violating women. And as I say here, it's probably related to the ongoing habit of dabbling in the dark arts among certain members of the population, not all, just certain members. I was looking up some news stories yesterday, and as recent as 2022, we were still having news reports about the oily man. But in P Ramlee's 1958 movie Sumpah Orang Minyak, he kind of turns it into a more epic story. You have a lot of things that you find in folklore. The idea of a person, the hero or the innocent, taken by the fairies, or in this case by the Buan, into another world, given some mystical attributes, and then later he breaks a curse, he breaks the spell, and he does something that is against the rules of how he ascends, and therefore he's thrown back to earth, or he becomes, in this case, invisible. So you have all of those grand narrative arcs happening in Sumpah Orang Minyak, which is why I'm so fascinated by it as an adult. As a kid, I watched it the first time I was 8 years old, and I didn't know what was happening. The more adult bits of it, I really didn't know what was happening. But I was really fascinated by the idea of the batik. Batik is our national art form where prints of flowers or natural things are turned into cloth that women or men wear, and it's part of our national pride, and it's so fascinating to me that he's made this as integral part of the movie. Now, who is P Ramlee? He is actually someone from Aceh. He's from Acehnese descent. So his real name is Tuku Zakaria Tuku Nyak Putih. He's one of the premier actors, producers, directors, and screenwriters of the Malay film world. He starred in 66 films, many of which he directed. He was also a singer-songwriter, and he wrote many of the stories that he starred in. He died in 1973 at the age of 44 in relative poverty, and it was really sad, the story of how he was such a huge figure in Malaysian popular consciousness. No matter what your race or religion, you would have heard of P Ramlee, and some of us grew up on his movies. He is known as a national figure. When he died, people were in grief, but the sad reality of it is that when he died, he was in poverty, he was facing bankruptcy, and that's how he died. He had a heart attack because he was going to be taken to court for bankruptcy, and the story of how he went bankrupt is kind of like, it's almost as though Sumpah Orang Minyak, without the rape aspect of it, was almost pathetic. His ascension into greatness and his descent into poverty, the sadness of it, they couldn't actually give him proper funerary rites. His wife couldn't because she didn't have the money for it. And that was the thought that came to me when I was starting to do a materialist critique of this. So he was born out of poverty along Conter Hall Road at an Acehnese community in Penang. He had to endure brutal Japanese occupation whose schools incidentally inculcated a certain discipline in him. In his formative years then, this discipline proved crucial as a founding platform for his eventual brilliance, creativity, and innovation in film and music. He came a very long way to become one of the greatest directors in Malaysian history. So he found success in the Jalan Ampas studios run by the Shaw brothers, where most of his movies were produced in Singapore. So Sumpah Orang Minyak was produced during this successful period in his life. And that made me ask the question, if this was produced before he gained poverty, before he returned to poverty, how is it those themes were in his movie? And that was the question I asked myself when I started doing this research. What happened was that after the successful period of in his life, because there were some political upheavals, Singapore kind of like separated itself from Malaysia, and the Shaw brothers started bleeding money. So eventually he returned to Malaysia, and he struggled to kind of like have his own studio, and he failed. He failed again and again and again, and eventually he died in poverty and bankrupt. So I kind of wondered, where was Sumpah Orang Minyak coming from? Because rewatching it, there was so much angst and anger, it felt to me, in the script itself. So in many ways, P Ramlee's success as a multi-talented producer, director, singer-songwriter, and screenwriter hinged upon the forces of production and capitalism, as he soon found out after countless attempts to establish his own studio and secure financing in Malaysia met with failure and disappointment. But Sumpah Orang Minyak came out during a relatively successful period of P Ramlee's career, which begs the question of the kinds of pressure he was experiencing and how that fed into the writing and directing of this morally complex epic. This is what William van der Heide wrote in 2002. The history of the Malaysian film industry is the history of local production, distribution, and exhibition. On one level, this history is quite distinct from the study of Malaysian film culture, which would concentrate on the circulation and reception of film in Malaysia. The second approach does not limit itself to locally made films, although it may well concentrate on them. In the case of Malaysia, it would pay attention to the Chinese, mainly Hong Kong, Indian, Tamil, and Hindustani, American, Indonesian, and other films shown in cinemas, viewed on video, watched on television, and discussed in the media. So there were a lot of influences. On another level, this film culture is inextricably linked to the local film industry, where over the decades, immigrant filmmakers have shaped the local industry, while imported films have influenced the culture and aesthetic character of local films, which brings us to Jalan Ampas. Jalan Ampas is famous in the Malay movie world because that's where the golden age of Malay film actually was born in Jalan Ampas, which are the Malay film studios in Singapore. So Timothy P. Barnard wrote that Chinese businessmen founded the Shaw Brothers Malay Film Productions and Cafe Keris in the late 1940s and early 1950s respectively, in an attempt to appeal to Malay-speaking customers in Singapore and Malaya by developing a profitable product for their cinemas. During this early phase, Indian nationals wrote and directed the vast majority of Malay productions through contracts with the Chinese businessmen who owned the studios. The plots of these films were often based on Indian tales, so you can see the Indian connection there. Now, during this period, Malays were only found in the front of the camera as they acted out scenes that their Indians and Chinese colleagues thought would be popular with the audiences. Despite their limited role, members of the Malay cultural intelligentsia often worked as translators of scripts or as assistants behind the camera. By the mid-1950s, as Malay was moving towards decolonization, there was a concerted attempt on behalf of the Malay talent on screen and the intellectuals behind the scenes to gain control over the filmmaking process. One of the leaders in this movement was P Ramlee, who broke several barriers when he directed and wrote as well as starred in Penarik Beca. So this happened in 1955. One of the fascinating things I've noticed upon rewatching Malay movies by P Ramlee is the amount of things that that he has adapted a lot of folk tales and fairy tales and a lot of stories that you may find existing in different forms in different from different languages. For me personally, this is why I've always thought of him as Malaysia's Shakespeare in a sense, because to draw parallels between the two, they both took different aspects from different stories and they turned it into their own. They were both writing to brief, they were writing to perform. And there's a great deal of bricolage and kind of like intertextual elements in his tales, which is where his brilliance lies. And you can see that happening in Sumpah Orang Minyak as well. Now, it is clear, therefore, from the dates, I mean, this is after the initial research I did, I suddenly realized, okay, he started directing and becoming more than just a figure in front of the screen or behind the scenes in 1955. Sumpah Orang Minyak came out in 1958, 3 years after P Ramlee's initial success to establish independence as a director and movie maker behind the screens, where power relations are definitely in play. I think a lot of people who look at P Ramlee's life knew that before that he was having rather humble beginnings. So you can see the ascension already evoked on the screen. We can already see the parallels it can be drawn between this and his life. So the struggle to gain prominence is depicted in Bongkok's ascension, first artistically and then spiritually in Sumpah Orang Minyak before Bongkok's eventual downfall, which follows the same patterns of ascension and downfall found in Matthew Lewis's The Monk. So What is material culture and why am I using it for this particular research? Richard Graspi wrote in 2005 that historians of material culture describe, categorize, and compare the characteristics of artificially constructed objects that have survived in physical or representational form, their size, shape, color, design, weight, and volume. So a lot of people think of material culture in terms of everyday things, fashion, the production of materials, art, culture. And Grasby says, with the help of literary and archival records, they identify and measure the quantity as well as the quality of goods, determine how they were made, distributed, and related to each other, when and where they appeared, and who acquired them for what use. But from a popular culture perspective, material culture could also look at how movies are made. The kind of power play and politics that go behind the history of the making of movies in the 1950s era of Malay movies, for example. Janelle Watson says that a plurality of logics guides the perceptions of material culture. Different practical and formal logics organize different fields of cultural production, and you can see the connection there between material culture and cultural production. The growing autonomy of cultural fields like art, literature, science, private space, commerce, etc. is recognized as a distinctive feature of modernity. Therefore, the culture behind which the Ampa Studios movies were made are very much important in understanding the plot lines of movies made by P Ramlee, which, even though they are a bricolage, actually really evoke the realities of life that were happening in a growing Malay culture of decolonizing themselves and trying to understand where they stood in the world. And what about myth? Myth and material culture, says Joseph L. Scarpacci, are intricately intertwined in the meaning of objects, especially in ancient sculpture, drawings, and ceramics. Sacred narratives, though, underpin most myths because they validate beliefs, rituals, and institutions. Sacred narratives, from the perspective of Sumpah orang Minyak, I would read as the ways in which kayangan is re-envisioned as the world of the Buan. In other words, every object has a story, and when individuals assume ownership of those items, they often ascribe meanings that may not be the original intent of the producer or the author. For instance, rugged individualism, as portrayed by the stoic cowboy of the 19th century American Western frontier, is a popular iconic image in the United States. Now, the reason why I find this personally significant is because the image of kayangan or the bunyan for many of my generation were actually defined by P Ramlee movies. Some of you, I don't know, I know some of you are my students here. I've seen at least 3 of them, know that I'm actually an author, and my Bunyan Empire series of short stories was actually based on the vision of the Bunyan as depicted in movies like this. So this is where my fascination comes in. And it's as though the production of the Bunyan within movies such as this kind of changed the way we thought about the otherworldly configurations of these beings. So I bring you now to the idea of abjection. How do we go from an otherworldly world of mythical beings to the idea of the abject? Now, Julia Kristeva in The Powers of Horror says that the abject is perverse because it neither gives up nor assumes a prohibition, a rule, or a law, but turns them aside, misleads, corrupts, uses them, takes advantage of them, the better to deny them. So the perversity of the abject is that it kind of upends whatever we may think of as being okay and turns it not okay. And the prohibition or rule is very much a part of what is happening with the main character of Sumpah orang Minyak, as I will show later. Now, Kristeva says, abjection accompanies all religious structurings and reappears to be worked out in a new guise at the time of their collapse. Several structurations of abjections should be distinguished from each one determining a specific form of the sacred. So the connection between the abject and the sacred is pretty much what I'm looking at in this particular research. Abjection appears as a rite of defilement and pollution, as you will see in the movie, in the paganism that accompanies societies with a dominant or surviving matrilineal character. It takes on the form of the exclusion of a substance, nutritive or linked to sexuality. Again, this is very much related to the downfall of the orang minyak in the movie, the execution of which coincides with the sacred site it sets up. The abjection then may be read as the defilement of the sacred and may be read in conjunction with the Burkean Sublime. So components of the abject, including death, defilement, and things that evoke a visceral recall, such as dark, oozy, oily substances, may be seen evoked in the figure of the orang minyak, a figure of terror in the Malaysian popular imagination. This symbol of depravity is depicted, sorry for the typo there, as being covered from head to toe in dark oil. It is therefore interesting that P Ramlee decided to depict this figure in a manner that incorporates the means of production, as in the batik production, issues to do with social ostracization and poverty, and the heavenly vision of a Buan kingdom. So finally, we move back to the discussion of Sumpah Orang Minyak, and I appear to have lost a slide. Oh my God. All right, so since I have lost a slide, I am just going to tell you the story. The story begins on a dark and rainy night. I kid you not, where the man, Selamat, he is a batik producer, kind of is heating up water in a kettle. And it's rainy, and a knock sounds on the door, and he opens it, and we see this young man called Bongkok. He is a hunchback. He has a mark on his face, and he is depicted as being someone who is being harried and bullied by the villagers. And Selamat takes him in and says, I told you that you should have stayed with me. He says, Bongkok says, I just want to stay here until the rain stops. But eventually he is persuaded by Selamat to live with him, and Selamat makes him coffee and says that stay here as long as you want. You do not give in to the bullies. This is what Selamat says to him. And so the next day, Selamat goes to sell his batik, and he discovers that people do not want to buy his batik cloth anymore because they say his patterns are old-fashioned. When he comes home, he finds that Bongko, in his absence, has started drawing patterns, and the patterns are so beautiful. Selamat gets really excited and says, okay, hey, let's kind of do something with this. And they start making these print blocks. You actually see them cutting down trees, not just cutting trunks of trees, turning them into print blocks and actually printing out these patterns on cloth. And this is the part that was really fascinating to me, where they have a happy life for a short while, where Bongko's patterns actually give Selamat a kind of a modicum of material success. But one day, Bongko is caught in the forest by some of the guys who were tormenting him, and they brought him to the village headsman, and they said he is still in our village even though we tried to chase him away. And from there, we realized that they are chasing him not only because of his appearance, but because his father has a fractured history with the inhabitants of Kampung Tualang Tiga, that is his village. So he is thrown out of the village. In his exile, he stumbles across the kingdom of the Buan. There, because of his virtues and his unhappy circumstances in life, he is taken in and is transformed into a handsome young man, and he has a romance with a Buan princess. Unfortunately, he decides to return to the world of humans. There he is for a time happy. He shows them new batik patterns. He's reunited with Selamat. He gives him new designs to revive his wealth. But tensions evoke. His old anger comes back. He kills one of his chief tormentors. And this angers the headsman of the Buan, who told him, you can return to earth, but don't kill anyone. If you kill anyone, all of the things that we have given to you will be taken back. So this is where he breaks the injunction, and because he breaks the injunction, he is punished with invisibility. Soon, a devil appears to him, Faustian-like, with a bargain from hell. In order to regain visibility and to be a normal human, he is required to take off his clothes, put on a ring that will afford him superhuman powers, and he is to rape 21 women in 7 days. He is then transformed by Satan into that figure of abjection, the oily man or the orang minyak. So the last quarter of the movie is when his terrible acts are depicted, shown mostly off-screen, and the focus of the story turns to the actions of the villagers to capture him. Then another young man becomes one of the main forces chasing him, and he becomes the hero of the tale. But eventually it is the leader of the Bunyan who captures Bongkok in a bottle. The young man becomes the headman of Kampung Tualang Tiga, and the Bunyan headman admonishes the villagers against further discrimination of people they consider lesser, so as to avoid the tragic events occurring. So if you look at the picture to the right of my slide, you can see the image of P Ramlee as a Bunyan prince, how he looks like in his most favorable aspect. And this may be juxtaposed with how he looks like later. So now we move on to the depiction of the Bunyan in Sumpah Orang Minyak. The depiction of the Bunyan's world in Sumpah Orang Minyak is part of the material critique that I want to carry out, because it bears a lot of similarities with how Kayangan is portrayed in some of the hikayats. But in Kayangan, which is like the Malay otherworldly paradise, most of the inhabitants are bidadari. There's a kind of like a cognate of the fairy, or sometimes Dewa and Dewi. So these are connected to the Hindu influences in early Malay Empire. So they were not Bunyan. Bunyan are actually known as the people of the sound. People who you can only hear. They are invisible, they are phantoms of the forest. But what P Ramlee did was that he gave them certain attributes that we usually think of as being associated with those from Kayangan. This is from Hikayat Raja Muda, one of our Malay epics, where the aspects of Kayangan were actually depicted, and these were not Bunyan, they were basically fairies. Yep. So there's a depiction of it. So I'm going to kind of stop this now. Sam, I'm going to be showing the YouTube video now. So you wanted to stop the video, right? Watched what may have been evident when you watched that clip was that we had this flying vehicle, which was very obviously made of paper mache or cardboard, but it was supposed to be a flying vehicle. And for me, it's significant because it kind of like evokes the wooden flying vehicle we see in Hikayat Raja Muda. Again, these are things that are connected to the Kayangan and not the Bunyan. But in the movie, P Ramlee has done two things. First, he has taken this kind of like Hindu origin Kayangan motifs from the Hikayats. He's made it part of the Bunyan world, and he has turned it Muslim. You've kind of seen that I'm here to carry out, the hitman of the Bunyan says, I'm here to carry out the orders of Allah, which is the Muslim Almighty. And you can see this integration of those different aspects in the world of the Bunyan in Sumpah Orang Minyak. So this brings us to the idea of the otherworld and the Burkean sublime. Now, if you notice in the clip, Bongkok kind of thinks he has done something wrong, even though he is surrounded by goodness and beauty. He is, what wrong have I done that you have brought me here? And I thought that was really significant. Perhaps because he has experienced suffering for most of his life, where he is confronted with beauty and the sublime, he thinks of it as more punishment. And this I connect to the Burkean sublime. When you are outside of yourself, Edmund Burke says, the idea of the sublime itself can feel like torment. It's like, and he says here, whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, and that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, even beauty can seem terrible to a person, yes, or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror, is the source of the sublime. That is, it is productive of the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling. I say the strongest emotion because I am satisfied the ideas of pain are much more powerful than those which enter on the part of pleasure. Without all doubt, the torments which we may be made to suffer are much greater in their effect on the body and mind, and any pleasures which the most learned voluptuary could suggest, or than the liveliest imagination and the most sound and exquisitely sensible body could enjoy. So when you see the character of Bongkok, who has been tormented by suffering and bullying for most of his life, when he is confronted with beauty and the sublime, in a sense, he doesn't know how to react to it. He feels that he's being punished, and of course, this leads him into a spiral of self-sabotage. In the end, he could have stayed in Kayangan, but he says, no, 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 I want to see my people in my village. But of course, he goes there and he falls into a rage. He kills the guy who was bullying him. Then he becomes invisible. Yep. So the Burkean Sublime therefore evidences a connection between terror and delight, pain and pleasure, which is probably why it is such a linchpin in the discussion of most Gothic works. It also has an intrinsic relationship with what Kristeva would later define as the abject. The other world of P Ramlee's imagining is therefore made more impactful in Sumpah Orang Minyak by the downfall of Bongkok, which was in many ways caused by how he was set up to grandeur in the world of the Buan. And I connect this to Ambrosio in The Monk, who is set up to be larger than life and perfect, and people kind of worship him in a sense. So he has a spectacular downfall after his ascension as a famous monk seen as a bastion for purity. And of course, he is seduced by Satan also. So these classical Gothic themes clearly derive from the same binary relationship evidenced by the Burkean Sublime. I draw parallels between the two texts primarily because both characters started out in poverty and relative abjection, and both have an ascension that is later undermined by dramatic character arcs. The difference, apart from culture, is that P. Ramlee's sort of morality play ends on a note of reprimand as the headman of the Bunyan says to the villagers of Tualang Tiga, so long as your village discriminates and ostracizes those amongst you seen as lesser, you will have these occurrences repeating. And I thought that that was actually startlingly progressive. You think that P. Ramlee was demonizing a disabled person, but he was saying that so long as you commit these acts against the lesser of you, so long as you will suffer, which is in a sense not just Bongkok being punished, but the village. No such message is evident in The Monk. Now, I conjecture, this is a conjecture at this point, yeah, that this may be related in a sense to the background of the two authors. P. Ramlee came from poverty and died in poverty. Matthew Lewis was firmly of the landed gentry and later became a politician. Everyone knows that Monk Lewis was actually quite well off. And this was not the case for P. Ramlee. And at the time when the movie was made, he was 3 years into his success. I would assume that the injuries he suffered prior to that was still very new to him, and perhaps it was a reminder to himself also. But again, as I said, this is just conjecture and it's nothing that's going to be in an academic paper. Yes, and that's the end. Thank you for listening.